Laura Justice.
How are you? I want to start by thanking Professor Gillen for bringing me here. It is truly an honor. It's also a little bit nerve-wracking to think I'm kicking off the next 2 days. What if I completely blow it? And thank you to Amy. They do a lot of work to make these things happen. And I also want to thank Angus. This is my second day in a row watching him welcome a group of people together, and it's really inspiring, and I thank you for that. And finally, I'd like to acknowledge the leaders of the local tribe, iwi. At the Better Start research meeting yesterday, I got to hear a lot about aspirations for Māori children and families, and I'm really excited about the keynote tomorrow, which will talk about intergenerational bilingual literacy. So very exciting 2 days. I'm going to talk about reading in the home environment. And so this will bring together a couple different strands of potential interest, thinking about the early years and their importance, thinking about parents' or caregiver role in facilitating early literacy, and then finally, the use of storybooks as a way to cultivate early skills. And no matter where I go, I just always seem to drag around a couple kids' books. They just come in handy, so probably in the next hour I'll do something with these. I'm going to start by letting you know where I'm from. So I'm from Ohio, near the East Coast of the United States. Maybe you've been there. I'm at Ohio State University. That's our, what are they called? Mascot, Brutus Buckeye. Do you know Brutus? Brutus probably makes a lot more money than I do as faculty, because we're really into sports at American universities. And so I came all the way from Ohio on the right to New Zealand. You can see the similarities in the landscape. You're welcome to come visit me if you feel inspired right now by that. So, and I want to acknowledge, I work with a lot of people. There isn't a thing I'm sharing today that's my original idea. These are all the product of a lot of people working together in thinking about how we can improve the lives of young children with a focus on home-based literacy practices. What I've done is divided this talk into 4 segments. And I'm doing that so you don't get bored. If you start to get wiped out on the first one, you can get excited because part 2 is coming. So we've got 4 segments. And the first one, I wanted to talk about an evidence-based early literacy intervention that we call Sit Together and Read, because this intervention ultimately is something that we ask parents to do. And when we ask parents to do this at home, we learn a lot about parent capacity to support their kid. And just as a caveat, I'm using the word intervention, which is a loaded term, and I just happen to use it because of the world I live in academically, but just think of intervention as a thing we do to bring about change. So if you want to use a more agnostic term like program or curricular or practice, they all mean the same thing to me. Okay, so a few foundational premises to Sit Together and Read, or this STAR reading program, is that what young kids know about print is crucial. So in the first 5 years of life, children are learning many things about print. They're learning about how books are organized and used in their environment. They're learning about how print functions within texts and throughout the community. They're learning the value of print as a symbolic system that is distinct from the oral language skills. They're learning about letters. They're learning about words. And some people would argue that this is a universal cognitive prerequisite to being able to read across any culture or language system in which people read texts. Understanding the forms and functions of print is absolutely a prerequisite. We have also found that print knowledge in young kids is a causal contributor to future reading. In other words, kids who have better knowledge about print are better readers in their future. So let's get away from the fancy talk for a second. What am I talking about? Well, this is a 5-year-old, and this 5-year-old has on his own made a, what is it? Study it carefully. Okay, let's start here. So on the left side, what is this? It's a happy child. Okay, what is this? It's an oven. And that is something going into the oven. What does that say? Bake. Exactly as that word truly ought to be written. I mean, the C is just as good as a K, and who needs that silent E, right? So this is a young child, and then over here you have more of the recipe. I know what this is. This is a bowl with a spoon, and what does that say? Stir. Exactly how that word should be written. S-D-R. That I is completely unnecessary, and that second sound is a lot more like the sound the D makes than a T makes. So when I talk about young kids' knowledge about print, I'm talking about this. I'm talking about the creative exploration that children do with written language. They do it very naturally. They do it happily. This is not harmful, and it's not developmentally appropriate. Lots and lots of kids are doing stuff like this by 5. What you have here is a child who knows a lot of the letters, understands what a word is, and understands the purpose of print. That print is used to organize ideas, in this case, how to make things, okay? So print knowledge is really important. The second foundational premise is that in New Zealand and in America and many other countries, for very complicated reasons, there are kids who walk into formal reading instruction who don't know much about print. I've always been deeply interested in kids who have language disorders. And if you look at, I mean, this is a very dated study, 10 years ago. This is kids at 3 and 4 years of age, and their knowledge about basic print concepts, like print moves left to right, top to bottom. You hold a book like this. This is what a letter is. And what you see for kids who are middle class, I'm going to use the word middle class, meaning kids who are relatively advantaged in their homes, but who have a language disorder, compared to kids who are also middle class advantaged, who don't have a language disorder, you have this gap in print knowledge present by 3 and 4 years of age, okay? That's a big gap, 1.2 standard deviation units. This, to me, is a critical precedent for lots of things that are likely to happen in kids' lives when they walk into reading instruction and they don't know a lot about print, okay? We see this pattern if we look at kids with disabilities, and we see it for kids who are reared in poverty, and the gap looks exactly the same. In the United States, we care a lot about what we call the achievement gap, and I'm assuming you talk about this here too. The achievement gap is when you see gaps in educational performance or outcomes across key subgroups of learners, like kids with disabilities. We have a massive problem with race in the United States. We have a black-white achievement gap that doesn't seem to be getting better. So the other foundational premise is that this early gap we see in print knowledge when kids are young, they're 3 and 4 years of age, they're babies, that we see this gap and it persists. So what you see here are growth curves of kids who have a language disorder and kids who are typically developing, and this is that gap when they're 4, and if you follow kids with language disabilities till grade 5, what you see is reading growth looks the same. These kids are not deviant in some way, but that early gap is never addressed, okay? This is a study we did a while back. Some studies show this gap actually gets bigger with time, okay? So when I talk about print knowledge in early childhood, it's not a trivial matter. It's important to kids in the moment and in their future. 20 years ago, we moved critically in the field of literacy towards a focus on prevention. Instead of waiting until kids are in 3rd and 4th and 5th grade and saying, oh my God, you can't read, what are we going to do about it? We realized that's a really lousy strategy for addressing reading problems in young kids. 98% of the time, these sort of post 3rd and 4th grade reading interventions are not very successful for kids, okay? So there's been a very strong emphasis towards thinking about preventing reading difficulties. I keep hearing data about kids in New Zealand. 35% of kids are exhibiting difficulties with school readiness. That's really important to have that conversation because it means you're vigilant about the fact that kids are walking into reading instruction not where you want them to be. That's the first step in prevention, identifying a potential problem, and then you have to act, okay? So Sit Together and Read is a shared reading practice that we developed quite a long time ago and have refined. And basically, it's when parents or anybody who reads with young kids, speech therapist, librarian, early educator, when you read with kids, you incorporate a print focus, an explicit print focus as part of the routine. Now, this seems silly and unnecessary, but I've watched a gazillion shared read-alouds between adults and young kids, and we'll do anything but talk about the print in the book. What do we talk about? The pictures, okay? 98% of adult talk is about the illustrations in the story. That's not a problem. I'm not saying we don't want to do that, but if we view literacy as important in young kids, the book is the perfect place to begin to introduce children to what print is, okay? If adults talk 98% of the time about print in the book, or about pictures, what are kids zeroing in on? The pictures. And in fact, we've used eye tracking technologies to look at what young kids look at when we read books with them. And even in books with really large print and speech bubbles, they are just staring at the illustrations, okay? So we have developed this shared reading practice that's really simple. We say when you read books with kids, have explicit conversations about print. This approach is now considered a fundamental practice in early childhood. There was a report that came out just this year that identified 9 empirically validated, robust techniques to improve kids' performance in literacy, and reading with a focus on print was number 2. Okay, so we have a very well-documented effects on kids' literacy development when they engage in repeated read-alouds with a print focus. 3 active ingredients. It's this easy. Number 1, print-rich books. Number 2, explicit attention to print. And in recent years, we've actually come up with a scope and sequence to help guide these interactions. What we do in our work is we typically work with teachers, and they enroll in our project called STAR. And if you're a teacher in our study, you're a teacher working with young kids, 3 to 4, you get a book a week. So these are all those print-rich books. You get a book a week, and then we say when you get this book, we want you to read it to the kids in your classroom and talk about print. So ingredient 1 is print-rich books. In the time that I've been, you're writing down those titles, I can send you a longer list of the books. So what's interesting is I started doing this work a long time ago, and there were fewer print-rich books than there are now. Do you have Mo Willems here? What? Yes, no? Mo Willems, if I could do a do-over in life, I would marry him because he's a genius and he's changing so many children's lives because his books are so phenomenal. And in the US, you can get them for $1. This is $1. Don't let the pigeon finds a hot dog. They're also hilarious. And I just got a list of the most circulated books in the children's collection in the biggest library in the United States. Number 1 is a Mo Willems book. Number 2 is The Cat in the Hat. How long has The Cat in the Hat been in circulation? Right? So Mo Willems, and he has like 8 of the top 10 books. And Scaredy Squirrel, these are newer books, and there's a lot of these interesting books coming out where the authors are really playing with print and making it a more compelling part of the story itself. So number 1, print-rich book. And number 2 is explicit attention to print as you read along with a child. So the typical style is stuff like this. What do you think this book is about? Perfectly reasonable. Nice prediction question. Good for comprehension. This book is about a garden. What's he doing here? The dog looks so sad. This is fine. but it doesn't need to be the only thing we talk about when we share books with kids, especially books that are really print rich. So we've been pushing adults to have explicit conversations about print as you read. This is the title. Look, the title is one big word in red print. What do you think this says? What do you think this says? These are okay things to talk about. And what we've done recently is we actually came up with a scope and sequence that we layer over multiple weeks of reading just to give some structure to the read alouds. And I'll show you exactly what this looks like in a minute. But we have 15 things that we want kids to learn about before they enter formal reading instruction, which in the US is about 5 or 6. That's when formal reading instruction begins. So we really want kids to understand book and print organization, print meaning, letters, and words. And so what we do, and you can do this too, this is not proprietary. You take a book, I like it when, and we say, teacher or parent, you're going to get I like it when this week, and we want you to talk about these two aspects of print knowledge, what an author is and what is the role of print. Okay, so this is that scope and sequence, and each time you read, you're to talk about two things. Does this make sense? And the way we manualize this is every book has a star card. So in the small pond, we stick a card inside the book and it says, as you read along, these are the things to talk about. Every single solitary thing I'm talking about is laid out in this book, which is free download. So you can just pull down the whole book and you have every single solitary thing you need, okay? And on this website, because we're trying to go at scale, and you have the manual, you have lots of videos, all the star cards, and we have a Spanish version that we've tested with monolingual Spanish speakers as well. Great effects. Okay, so the way this works is we take a book like Rumble in the Jungle, that's $1. I mean, this is not an expensive thing to do with kids. Rumble in the Jungle, and then you have these two things to talk about. And word identification and concept of letter makes sense with Rumble in the Jungle because of the look of the book. So you have letters that make sounds. You have these big words to introduce to kids. I mean, it's easy to talk about this word representing this referent, okay? So within the context of this read aloud, these discussions are highly appropriate given the look and the feel of the book. Okay, we see consistently good effects when we have parents read to their kids or teachers read to the kids and introduce a print-focused style. We see that it benefits kids' early literacy development. So this is a study with 106 3 to 5-year-old kids with 3 measures, one of basic print concepts, not unlike Mari Clay's little concepts about print test, alphabet knowledge, and then name writing. We also see that the effects endure for 2 weeks post-exposure. So this is kids' performance whose teachers read to them with a print referencing style for a year in preschool, and the kids were followed 2 years later and given the standardized Woodcock-Johnson test of reading achievement, measures of word reading, spelling, and reading comprehension, and you see that kids got this bump, okay? So the point here is, number one, there are actually really simple things we can do to support kids' early development of literacy. We don't need to go buy super special crazy curricula. We can just read in a way that helps kids begin to internalize knowledge about the forms and functions of print. I know there's people here who are interested in kids with language impairment. We did a very large-scale study in 83, they're called early childhood special education classrooms that serve half of the kids have disabilities and half are typically developing kids. We had about 1,000 kids in the study, and teachers read with a print focus across the academic year, and we saw significant positive effects for kids with language disorders, which is reported here. I think this article came out a year or 2 ago. And we just published a paper showing that the effects endure for 1 year post-intervention. So if you're interested in kids with disabilities, kids with language impairment, we see that these effects are consistent, whether we're working with typically developing kids, kids living in poverty, kids with disabilities. The fact is that reading books with kids and talking about print seems to boost their early development and progress in literacy. Okay, so we have this repeatedly tested, really simple, cheap shared reading practice. It's a recommended practice. It's an essential practice. What about parents? It would be great if we could just say, well, you know, tomorrow's keynote is about intergenerational literacy practices. You know, this is a great opportunity to work with caregivers and their children and say, you know, regular reading is a good practice. And in fact, as you read, you can incorporate talk about print, and that's going to boost kids' development into the future. That's a very ideal situation. We did that a long time ago. It all started with a pilot study. I think this was published in 2000, so I was like 12. So this is one of the first papers I ever published. I was so proud of it. But it was a pilot study where we had 4 parents. We had 4 parents, and the kids all had developmental disabilities, okay? I know one child had Down syndrome. I think another child had autism. They all had language disorders. And we had the parents read with their kids with a print focus for 4 weeks. This was a little pilot study. They got a new book each week for 4 weeks, something like Hug. And then we said, we want you to talk about print when you read. And I think we showed parents a short video that modeled this behavior. And on a measure of print knowledge, you know, this is pilot work. It's okay. It's not great science, and that's fine when you're in the pilot phase. So this is a measure of kids' development of print knowledge, and what you see is 3 kids showed gains. Okay, their parents read to them for 4 weeks. They talked about print. Some of the parents were kind of scary in their zeal in doing this. And you see kids seem to grow, right? The other thing is we had parents provide some satisfaction information, like, did my child like this? And on a scale of 5, they were really positive, okay? The one on, we must have mentored them. My kid, look at this. My child benefited, perfect score. Okay, that's like an Olympic gold medal. So, you know, we're seeing, okay, well, parents are doing this at home with their kids who have disabilities, and they say they like it, and it seems like the kids might be benefiting. And we followed that up with a small experiment. And in this case, we did the same 4-week program, and we had 28 parents, and we split them into 2 groups randomly. And we had some parents read with a print focus, and the others we said read as you normally read. And those controlled parents who read as they normally read are the reasons I know parents don't talk about print, because we always record everything. They don't talk about print. And so what we found is really good effects with our middle socioeconomic status sample. Okay, with our 28 parents, what we saw is for 4 weeks, kids whose parents read with a print focus showed greater gains in measures of print knowledge than kids whose parents read the same books, same schedule, their normal style. Does that make sense? Okay, so this is awesome. So we did it again, but now we're getting at the population I'm interested in, which is kids with language disorders. And in this case, we got 62 parents. All of them had a 4-year-old child who had a language impairment. And we actually had them read for 12 weeks. And one of the reasons we did that is we assumed 4 weeks isn't going to be enough for kids with language impairment. We need to give them a really healthy boost, healthy opportunity to develop these print skills. And what we did is we actually quasi-scripted the reading for parents, and we put little things in the book to say, on this page you could point out this word. And they did it 9 times per book. And we did that because we had seen in our prior study that some parents became print-focused monsters. Because we're listening to these reading sessions, the mom is like, what's that letter? What's that letter? And the kid is like, Mom, can we read the book? So we actually had one mom in the parent study who talked about print like 182 times in a 10-minute read aloud. So we don't want to ruin kids' lives, right? So we made a rule. You can't talk about print more than 9 times. And in fact, what we would do is we would load up talk about print on a really good page. Like, maybe this page, which is what's that called, the title page. This is a really good time to talk about, the word hug, why is it so big, who's the author. And what we found, the other thing that's interesting about this is our target sample is parents of kids who what? Have a language disorder. So what happened with this study is we're all over the place in terms of socioeconomic status. We see great effects on kids. So the kids, this is actually, don't worry about it, it's more or less a control condition. It's just a super good control condition. And what we see is on measures of alphabet knowledge and print concepts, kids whose parents read with a print focus made massive gains, okay? However, what's the however? Anybody? We have a check for you if you can get this right. We have checks galore. What's the however? Anybody?
Yes.
It wasn't S? Well, it kind of is. Oops, let me skip let me point this out. The parents also loved this. So we asked them, did you like this? Look, 4.8 out of 5. They loved this. They also got $100 at the end. And books for 12 weeks and tape recorders, but they all loved it. But look at this. Just look at this for a minute. Here's our print focus reading condition, and here's our control condition. Parents, we had 62 parents. They were given a book a week for 12 weeks. It was delivered to them, and I think they were to read 3 times. It could have been 4. We lost 1/4 of parents. They walked away from the $100 bill. They walked, okay? And it actually had nothing to do with being in the intervention condition. They just said, I can't do this. I can't read to my child like you're asking me to. I don't have time. Or my family's going through trauma. Or I hate this. I hate you. Why are you making me do this? So we lost 1/4. And I was astonished. I was an idealist. And I was like, of course, I hear this all the time. I hear it all the time in policy conversations. I don't get why parents can't just read to their kid. Well, you don't get it because it's a normal practice for you. But it's not a normal practice for others, okay? We did some analysis. Who are our 16 parents we lost? They were slightly younger, but they were not young moms, okay? They were in their 30s compared to like late 30s. They were not slightly, that's a large effect size. They were less educated. They tended to be poor readers. We had a direct assessment of reading fluency. And the kids were actually slightly more skilled than kids. So maybe parents were like, well, we don't need this. We don't know, okay? So we lost 1/4 of our parents. And we worked really hard with these families, and they disappeared on us. We later did another study. I mentioned this. We were in 83 preschool special education classrooms. These serve half kids with disabilities. So we had about 1,000 kids in these classrooms, 1/3 of whom had a diagnosed language impairment. And in this study, the classrooms were assigned to 3 conditions. And it had to do with home and school. So in condition 1, parents and teachers each got a book a week, the same book. And we said, read it using your normal style. In the second condition, parents, we said, read using your normal style. And teachers, we said, read and talk about print. And in this third condition, which we thought would be awesome, we had parents read with a print style and teachers read with a print style. Are you following? We really wanted to see if parallel home and school implementation was value added for kids. And you would think it would be. This is popular parlance. homeschool communication, strengthen family ties, promote home reading. You know, this should be, you know, this should knock it out of the park. And this is a paper we published. And the parents, we actually said just read twice a week. Because we were worried with this prior study, we were like, well, maybe asking parents to read 3 or 4 times is too much. So let's just say twice a week. What we found is parents didn't really do what we wanted them to do. So how do we know this? Well, it's actually very, very, very difficult to study home reading practices. Because short of moving in with a family, you have to rely on parent report. And people are always critical of this, and I'm like, well, what are you going to do? Like, solve this for me if you don't like what I'm doing. So what we do is parents get a book a week, and in the back of the book is a postcard. They pull off the postcard and they say, yes, I read this twice this week, and they just drop it in the mail. That's what we do right now, okay? It's addressed, everything. That's all you got to do. So they had 30 weeks. And they got a book a week, so they had 30 weeks, and they had to check, yes, I read this once, and yes, I read it twice, and here's we call it a log. And what we did, so on average, parents submitted about half of those logs. And we did something called a latent class analysis that lets you say, well, are there like profiles of parents? And we found 4 profiles that depicted parents' response or submission of logs over 30 weeks. So we have these people, 7%, there's the starters, then they disappear, and then they come back. Then we have these people, they're like all in, and then they disappear, 16%. Look at this, 38% were awesome. They did they're like the religious, these are the people who can run a marathon after 12 weeks. Because they religiously go out for their runs each week, okay? And then look at these. This is me. When I'm like, I'm going to run a marathon before I'm 50. I'm going to start next week. And then I run for 8 weeks. I'm like, ugh, this stinks. And I'm out of there, right? So the problem is this was 40% of our parents. Now, you can push back and you can say, I don't actually believe that's a valid representation of what people are doing. But I don't think there's a better way today, okay? We have to use parent report. And frankly, 40% of parents either weren't submitting logs and disappeared, or they just read the book happily and didn't feel like mailing the postcard. But that number isn't that surprising when you see we lost about 30% of parents in our home reading program. And the fact is, this is when I got mad, because I started digging through all the literature on home-based reading, and people are not being honest about attrition. We have a lot of if you're an SLP or SLT, we have a lot of studies where we ask parents to do things, and the only ones that are successful are with middle-class parents. Once you start working with parents who exhibit challenges, we're not reporting attrition. We're being dishonest in our research. I believe this is true. But I did find a couple people who said we were doing shared book reading programs with high-risk parents, and they lost the same amount we did, okay, if you start digging. And the thing is in other literatures, they're really honest about this. So if you go and look at like home visiting programs where nurses go into homes, there's a whole body of literature on how can we retain families. And piles of studies where they're looking at different ways to maintain relationships with families via these nurse partnership programs. We don't have that in our field. It doesn't exist in the world of early educational interventions to a large extent. So I got kind of mad because I thought, you know, we're really doing a disservice in publishing all these papers saying parents can do all these great things, when the reality is there's a subset of parents who can't. And those, paradoxically, are the parents we most are concerned about. So why don't people do what they're supposed to do? I mean, come on. Here's a book a week. Read it to your kids. Submit the postcard. Why don't people do, I had some notes. I was like, if I think about my household, why don't we eat at the dinner table with our kids and talk about our awesome family? We never eat at the dinner table, but that's like parenting 101 is you're supposed to sit down and have dinner together. We don't. Why don't we live on a budget? We're supposed to live on a budget. My budget is called faith-based budgeting. Let's not run out. Why don't I floss my teeth? Come on. I know there's people in here who don't floss your teeth, but you're supposed to, okay? So why don't we do what we're supposed to do? Another nicer way of saying that is, what are the barriers that impede us from doing things that are good for our kids or ourselves? What are the barriers? And that's what we have to think about when we think about early literacy. What are the real and honest barriers that people are facing? And a lot of times these barriers are not apparent to us because they're not the barriers we've faced. So let's think about Kavitha. Kavitha's a 21-year-old single mom. She works at Burger King. Do you have Burger King? Okay. For 40 hours a week. The family lives on about $15,000 US a year. That's not very much. She quit school at 10th grade. She never reads for pleasure. And when she was a little kid, she was diagnosed with ADD and learning disabilities. And her 4-year-old son is in speech therapy, and she's been told to read every day to her son. What are the barriers? Why can't Kavitha do this? I mean, what do you think? She doesn't like her kid? Because sometimes that's what I hear people say. These parents, they just don't care about their kids. Is that true? It's not. Why not?
She doesn't value reading.
She what?
She doesn't value reading.
She doesn't value this. And that's okay. That's her lived experience. Okay? What else is a barrier? She has no time. Time pressures. Her sister, I don't know if you have guns in New Zealand, but we have a lot of gun violence where I come from. I'm not kidding. I read the newspaper every day. And we have families that leave our studies because their sister was shot. This is true. Okay, so let's take LM. She's a 33-year-old first-time mom, married with a working partner, assistant professor, household as well, not high above the poverty line. She's a professor, but she's okay. She has 4 degrees, and she reads every day for pleasure. And she has a baby, and she's told to do physical therapy exercises with her baby who has severe torticollis. What are the barriers? Time?
Might not see the benefit.
What?
Might not see the benefit.
Might not see the benefits, like I'm doing this and, okay. The reality is, that was me. That was my baby, Adelaide. She's named after a city in Australia. Why didn't I did not do this. I would not do this. When we had a physical therapy, we had early intervention, and my daughter's head was like this. Now she just has a slightly drooped eye and can't wear sunglasses well. But I hated it. I hated doing these exercises with her. It made me miserable. I didn't like it. I was so uncomfortable. She was screaming, it hurt her. And I'm very dubious about the whole research base in physical therapy. Sorry, is there a physical therapist in the room? I'm just always questionable. I'm like, really, that'll help. So I had questions about efficacy, and frankly, I didn't like it. And I was actually willing to let my poor child deal with the consequences of not doing this with her. With the caveat that I have a husband that'll do anything that makes me uncomfortable. So I had a little help there. But we have to be honest about barriers. It's not just poor families or at-risk families. We all have barriers, okay? And so we were able, so I was digging. I couldn't find this study with New Zealand, but I figure Australia's right across the river. So I found this study, Barriers to Parent-Child Book Reading at Home, And they had 12,000 2, 4, and 6-year-olds in the longitudinal study of Australian children. Now this is a little bit dubious, but look at this. Only half of parents in this study said they read every day to their kids over there, okay? I don't know if that generalizes. I said I was going to New Zealand, and half the people in Ohio think I'm in Australia. So they're like, oh, you'll love Australia. I'm like, no, it's New Zealand. I don't get it. But so in this article, you know, we've got at least 1 in 5 parents who say, I really seldom read to my kid, okay? Why? Why? And that's what we have to understand if we're going to make impacts. And they actually looked at barriers. They were like, why are these parents not reading to their kids? And they looked at ethnicity, children's basically self-regulation, some maternal variables, do they speak a language other than English? And what they showed is that your risk of not being read to, which is here, goes up the more risks you have. Okay, duh, right? But what are we going to do? Not duh, like it's a bad study, but yes, you would expect the more risks that are in a person's life, like Kavitha, the more likely it is you're not going to be able to engage in these regular activities. So implementation science is a field of science that's new, and it's exciting because it exists solely to tackle things like this. It offers a scientific approach to identifying what are barriers that keep people from doing the things we want them to do. And in fact, some people argue that the best return on our buck for investments in science should be here. That we have all the evidence-based interventions we need. We just need to invest in the science to get them into the field, okay? And so it's an intensive analysis of implementation. And I really like this. It's called the Theoretical Domains Framework, kind of a fancy name, but it's a problem-solving approach to say, well, why aren't people doing what we want them to do? So let's talk about physicians. And physicians tend to overprescribe back x-rays for chronic pain. And it's contraindicated. You're not supposed to do it, okay? And there's even practice guidelines out there saying, don't do x-rays. But they do them anyway. Why? So we can actually, here's the problem. Why are you giving unnecessary x-rays to people? And then you have to identify barriers, or what we call behavioral determinants. So I'm a physician, you see me, I do an x-ray even though I'm not supposed to. Why? What is determining my behavior? What do you think? What? Bingo. Who just said that? What'd you say? Patients expect it. They're like, well, aren't you going to x-ray? It's like my mom, every time she gets a cold, she goes, give me an antibiotic. And the doctor's like, no, we don't do, give me an antibiotic. She wants an antibiotic for colds, which you're not supposed to do, and she gets them. And then you identify the technique that affects that behavioral determinant. So if patient insisting on an x-ray is determining the physician behavior, what is the evidence-based technique that reduces that barrier? What do you think? Educate the patient. It's patient education. This is why I'm not going to do it, and it's actually risky. So what you do is you get this change of logic. So here you have the problem over use of x-rays, and one of the issues, and they found this out by interviewing physicians, patients want it, they insist on it, so we can do patient education as a technique to erase that barrier. Make sense? So we can actually test techniques that are identified as linked to that barrier, but this is scientific. It has to be scientific. It's not just, oh, poor parents don't read to their kids because they don't know how to read. It's scientific. So, behavior techniques in parents' home reading. Can we apply this to learning about why are 20 to 50% of parents not regularly reading to their kids? So we have to identify which behavior needs to be changed. So all of you, raise your hand. if you met this guideline last week, did you do 150 minutes of moderate aerobic activity where you broke a sweat and strength exercise? So raise your hand if you did this. Okay, there's a whole bunch of you who didn't raise your hand. You're supposed, don't you want to live forever and have a great figure, look young? So why aren't you, what is the barrier? Somebody tell us, what's the barrier? Is it always, can't you wake up earlier? She said priorities. So for us, here's what we want to change. We want all parents to be like this, if at all possible. So we don't want 40% of parents to disappear. So there are common sets of barriers that we can play with. So think about yourself. Why didn't you meet those exercise guidelines last week? Is it knowledge? Do you not actually know you're supposed to do that? Is it skills? Do you not even know how to start? Is it, I forget what this one is. I don't know what that is. Beliefs about consequences. You're like, well, even if I exercise it's not going to make a difference. I'm so unhealthy and tired all the time. It's not going to help me. Here's a big one. Intentions follow through. Every week I'm like, next week I'm going to exercise every day. And I never do. I always think it's going to be different this time, and it's not. Environmental context, maybe you can't get to the gym. Maybe you work nights. Social influences, all your friends are like, don't go to the gym. Let's do happy hour. Okay. Behavior regulation. So you got it. What's going on? Because you're not going to change the behavior until you identify the barrier. And that needs to be scientific. So we were able to dig through old data we have, and we theorized that for parents, one of the reasons they're quitting our reading program, we came up with 4 reasons based on a retrospective analysis of data we had on parents. We believed that we had a subset of parents who had no confidence in reading. Parents perhaps who had a history of reading difficulties themselves. We also had another one, it's about empowerment. They didn't feel that they could bring about a change in their child. They didn't feel empowered to do this thing with their kids. Then time pressures or intentions is another one. And then we thought we had parents who just don't know how to read to kids. So we analyzed 4 things that we thought were barriers. And in the world of implementation science, what you can do, you don't have to memorize all this, but you go through these steps, and we had these issues we identified, and these are what we believe are the barriers. And then there's research that says, well, if your barrier is time pressures, reward is an empirically validated intervention. So we see this in weight loss research and smoking cessation research. I want to go to the gym and lose weight. What they find is that rewards can actually help you if your problem is intentions. If it's self-confidence, you can get positive supportive feedback. So these are evidence-based techniques that are aligned to the barriers we think keep parents from reading. Okay? So it's very systematic. So we did an experiment. We got 128 parents of 4-year-old children who all had language impairment, and they were on the clinical caseload at a local urban children's hospital. Okay? And so what we did, this is called a factorial experiment. If you're not a research geek, don't worry about what a factorial design is. But we have these 4 conditions: reward, feedback, model, and encourage. That's these things. And we're going to test, do these 4 techniques, these behavior change techniques, do these change parents' reading practices? And so what we actually have is 16 conditions. And we have the people in condition 1 just got reward, condition 2 just got feedback, 3 just got modeling, but then you actually have every combination. And you can say, well, does feedback plus a reward boost ongoing reading? So here's our techniques. So reward, we paid parents 50 cents for every reading, okay? And I should clarify, these parents were actually enrolled in the STAR reading practices for 15 weeks. So we said, you're gonna read with your kid for 15 weeks. I think it was 15 weeks times 4 readings, so it's 60 read-alouds a book a week, okay? So some parents got paid for every reading they recorded. Other parents got feedback, one-on-one coaching every 3 weeks, live coaching. And parents were submitting audio tapes, we were watching, so we were coaching parents. And we called that feedback. Then we also had modeling where every 3 weeks we'd meet one-on-one with parents and we'd say, here's your next book, let's read it together, I'll show you, let's make sure you're comfortable. And then the last one was encouragement. So we gave ongoing text messages. Does this make sense? So we don't know, we think we've identified 4 barriers. And these are techniques from the research literature that says these techniques should affect your barriers. By the way, we didn't expect that. I went into this saying, it's a study of implementation science. All parents will implement. But we lost 30% of our parents. And they were going to the hospital. They enrolled in the study, they knew what they were getting into, and they all were getting money at the end of the study as well as those in the reward condition. We lost 30% of our parents. And we actually are not really able to figure out the difference between parents who dropped out and who didn't. We're actually working on email. I'm like, did you look at this? Did you look at this? We can't reliably say why some parents left and others didn't. So are you ready for the big reveal? So we tested 4 behavior change techniques. Which one do you think, of any, okay, we'll just do a little tally. How many people are going to put their money on reward? Okay. How about feedback? All the SLP should vote for feedback. How about modeling? Okay. How about encouragement? Are you ready? Just look at it for a minute. So now we had a small set of parents who are in the control condition, okay? They got nothing. On average, they read 25 times out of 60. So this is baseline. This is no technique. So talk to me about reward. What happened when we rewarded parents? They read to their kids more. How many more books? 10. 10 more readings for parents who were getting paid. Let's go over to encouragement via text message. This is actually a slightly bigger effect, but encouragement read 8 to 10 times more than the control. So, what are you never going to do again? So, feedback, 20 fewer readings than reward. I had a huge aha moment here about all the times I give my husband and children feedback and it doesn't work. It's like, I'm just going to start paying for stuff. So, and then modeling was less. So we actually had 2 conditions. Parents read significantly more. Okay? Now, you could be sitting there right now saying, well, the parents who were getting paid, they're just lying. Well, come on. These people didn't know other people were getting paid, you know? So we do have to, at least to some extent, trust the data here. So what we found is paying encouraging parents resulted in 10 more readings than the control. Theoretically, paying addresses the barrier of time, pressure, and intention. Okay? Theoretically, encouragement empowers. Laura, keep reading. You're helping Adelaide develop as a reader. Okay? Providing feedback resulted in 20 fewer readings. The parents who were getting feedback are like, yeah, you take your books and I'll tell you what, I'm just not going to read to my kid anymore. So the other thing, I don't have the full model here. We're writing this up as we speak. Is the full model works that you have parents implementing you have the 4 conditions. It affects implementation, okay? But then the next outcome is kids' growth over 15 weeks. And the experiment works perfectly. Which kids grew the most? Yeah, them. Okay? So the theory of change works. We have a behavior change technique. It had an effect on the desired practice. And the increased use of the desired practice had a positive effect on kids' development. So, am I telling you to give every parent in New Zealand 50 cents every time they read to their kid? No. However, this is just the beginning. This is, as far as I know, the first use of a theoretical domains framework to truly try to address barriers that keep parents from doing the things we want them to do at home, okay? So what I would suggest is, first of all, we have to critically think about the barriers that keep parents from doing things. So I think tomorrow the talk is probably about intergenerational literacy in indigenous families. And I work in indigenous villages in Mexico with families who speak Maya and Spanish, and guess what a really big barrier there is? They have no books. And they have no books that are bilingual, that have Maya and Spanish. So we have to seriously think about what are the barriers that inhibit parents or any other caregiver for doing what we want, okay? Then we have to experiment with different ways to potentially get rid of that barrier. Does it have to be 50 cents a reading? No, but I think we could look for lots of ways to reward the things we want adults to be doing, okay? What are ways we can reward and honor parents who do the things we want them to do that might not feel comfortable? So we have to think critically, what is a reward to a parent, and it doesn't have to be paying. Encouragement, text messages of encouragement. You know, Gail probably hears this in her job too. I run a big center with a lot of people, and every once in a while I'll have a one-on-one with someone, and they're like, you know, I sure wish I heard more often how valued I am. Like, we forget to encourage people to do the things we want them to do. So maybe this is a very simple strategy we can use to help parents implement a very simple routine in their home. So I would ask that, you know, I would suggest this is just the beginning as you move forward, especially in your Better Start initiative, to think about how we can enable and empower all parents, you know, to employ evidence-based literacy promotion strategies in their home. Thank you.